My future sister-in-law was the catalyst for my miscarriage, yet somehow, she was still welcomed into our lives. During my subsequent pregnancy, she mocked me and tarnished what should have been a joyful experience. Let me share this with you, dear readers. If it weren't for my own life, you might find this story hard to believe. Some days, I feel like I'm living in a dark and twisted Lifetime movie. My ex-sister-in-law was responsible for the loss of my first child. Yes, you read that correctly. Yet, she was still invited to our next pregnancy announcement. It's utterly insane. And it gets even crazier, involving a wedding, a kidnapping, and legal troubles. I never imagined I would be saying this about my family. 5 years ago, I went on a blind date with Caleb. My sister, Isabella, was hesitant about the whole thing. You know those scary stories that make you worry? I forgot all my concerns the moment I met Caleb. He made me feel like I was the only girl in the room with his charm and undivided attention. He noticed how my eyes sparkled when I flirted and how my lips curled into a pout when I liked something. I found it adorable and pure. I was smitten from the very beginning, convinced I would never fall for anyone like this again. He joked about how his family was a bit eccentric, and I laughed, saying that we were all a little crazy, not taking it too seriously. Oops. Fast forward 2 years, and I was walking down the aisle to marry him. Interestingly, our first relationship issue arose on our wedding day. It was the first time I met his brother's girlfriend, Serafina. I was dressed in white, my makeup professionally done, still riding the high of our vows and a few drinks. I approached Serafina to introduce myself, determined not to comment on her outfit, which was almost white, because I'm not one to create conflict. I moved in for a hug, but she pushed me away, looking utterly disgusted. She told me I was embarrassing and that I didn't like attention. I kept dancing, trying to shake off her negativity, but she continued, saying she was glad Caleb had such low standards because if he were more like his brother Ethan, he would have slapped me for even considering him. I was taken aback. Why would anyone brag about their partner hitting a woman? I ignored her and kept dancing, which only seemed to fuel her anger. Maybe she had some issues, but she returned a few minutes later with a glass of wine and flung it at me, ruining my wedding dress. Then, in a shocking twist, she said she knew Caleb and I wanted kids and prayed I would never have any. It was so random and hurtful. I wanted to cry, but I didn't want to ruin my day. I composed myself, stepped outside, called my friend Meline, had her bring me a spare white dress, changed, and went back to the dance floor. I refused to let Serafina's negativity ruin my special day. I didn't tell anyone what she had done, not wanting to give her the satisfaction of ruining my happiness. Now, I regret that choice. Caleb and I started trying for a baby soon after our wedding. We had always wanted children, and now that we were married, we felt ready. A few months later, I found out I was pregnant. But then calamity struck. Serafina tripped me, and I fell belly first against the stair railing, resulting in a miscarriage. Though I should have been devastated, I convinced myself it was an accident. Caleb and I hadn't told anyone about the pregnancy since it hadn't started showing. Looking back, I now think Serafina knew. She kept asking cryptic questions and encouraging me to drink beer, which was heartbreaking. The worst part was that after our next doctor's appointment, we learned it was unlikely I would get pregnant again. I saw Caleb cry for the first time that day. No one knew what had happened, but the next time I encountered Serafina, she seemed particularly cheerful and started making comments about loss and how terrible it was. I was baffled. She had killed my baby and was so proud of herself that she joked about it while I was still in the dark. A few months later, the universe smiled upon us again, and I found out I was pregnant once more. Caleb and I cried tears of joy, and he was on his knees, kissing my belly. Before I knew it, he was calling in sick to work just to take me out for a celebratory meal. My baby needs food, he said, and I couldn't help but smile. After a few months, we hadn't told anyone from either of our families, but we had something special planned. With the help of my best friend Meline, we created a beautiful nursery for our baby girl. She suggested that we should have consulted other parents before purchasing what she deemed cheap knockoffs. Her dismissive and condescending tone startled me. Until that moment, I had been courteous, expecting her to be straightforward, but this crossed a line. I lost my composure. "What on earth are you talking about?" I exclaimed, frustration bubbling over. Caleb and I had poured our hearts into creating a perfect life for our baby, so her words were shocking. It was clear she didn't want to offer genuine advice. Instead, she seemed intent on undermining the joy of the evening. Just then, my mother, Vivian, and my mother-in-law entered the nursery, and Serafina was ready to respond, beaming at the room. Their enthusiastic praise of how wonderful everything looked temporarily eased the tension. However, I couldn't ignore Serafina's earlier comments. I turned to her again, asking, "What exactly did you mean by that?" My mother and mother-in-law noticed the tension and sensed something was off. Mom asked what was going on, and I explained how Serafina had criticized the nursery and called our carefully chosen baby clothes cheap. Both women looked stunned that someone would be so openly disparaging, especially during such a precious occasion. My mother-in-law laughed and asked Serafina, "Is this true?" Serafina seemed taken aback by the sudden confrontation and tried to downplay her earlier remarks. She claimed the fabrics were too rough and suggested softer options, but my mother and mother-in-law didn't buy it. They shook their heads and quietly laughed, saying the clothing felt lovely. Serafina soon backtracked, asserting that as a mother, she knew better and that I should be open to criticism. My mother, speaking firmly yet calmly before I could respond, said, "Well, we're mothers too, and we'd never say that to her. You should know how hard it is being a first-time mother." My mother-in-law chimed in, adding, "This isn't appropriate behavior, Serafina. There's a difference between offering advice and being needlessly critical." Serafina's face flushed as she realized she was outnumbered and wrong. She was clearly offended but said little. In a huff, she left the nursery. I followed her out, hoping to prevent any escalation. Serafina went straight to Ethan, who was still chatting with family in the living room. Without explanation, she announced she was leaving immediately. Ethan looked bewildered but didn't argue, sensing her anxiety. He apologized to everyone and congratulated Caleb and me on the pregnancy again before leaving with Serafina. After our announcement dinner, Ethan called Caleb and me to apologize for Serafina's behavior. After my mother-in-law chastised him for bringing her to such a private family event, he learned everything that had transpired. I immediately forgave Ethan because I realized it wasn't his fault. He felt worried and sought to explain Serafina's inappropriate behavior. He told us that Serafina had experienced trauma related to pregnancy. At 16, she had become pregnant with her son, and after they married, they faced difficulties trying to have more children. Their mental health suffered after years of infertility, which ultimately led to their divorce. Ethan explained that Serafina was particularly sensitive to other women's pregnancies, which might explain her unpleasant reaction to our celebration. While I understood Serafina's challenges as a woman and empathized with her grief and disappointment, her comments during our dinner announcement were still inappropriate. I decided it would be best to maintain some distance from her at future family gatherings to protect the positive atmosphere I wanted to cultivate around our growing family. Ethan and Serafina continued dating, and on the day I delivered Charlotte, Ethan called to ask Caleb if he could bring Serafina to visit our newborn. Although we had reservations, Caleb and I reluctantly agreed, hoping things would be different this time. Unfortunately, that proved to be a mistake. As soon as Serafina saw our baby, she immediately commented on how little hair our newborn had, suggesting that this meant Charlotte would have extremely thin hair as she grew. Her words felt like a direct attack, and I could see the irritation on Caleb's face as well. This was yet another unnecessary and insensitive remark during what should have been a purely joyful moment. Sensing the tension in the room, Ethan didn't allow Serafina to stay long. After offering brief congratulations, they quickly departed. This year, Ethan shocked everyone by announcing his engagement to Serafina. The news received mixed reactions, particularly from my mother-in-law, who openly expressed disappointment with Ethan's decision to marry Serafina, having never wanted her to become part of the family. Apparently, my mother-in-law and Serafina had been clashing for months. Knowing my mother-in-law is typically warm and kind-hearted, I suspected Serafina's behavior was likely causing their ongoing tension. When Caleb called Ethan to discuss the sudden involving Serafina, Ethan, Caleb, and my mother-in-law, Ethan reached out to me, apologizing for Serafina's behavior and clarifying that I was still very much invited to the wedding. He urged me not to take her words too seriously and assured me that bringing Charlotte was absolutely fine. I felt a surge of anger towards Serafina and considered skipping their wedding entirely, but I knew that supporting Caleb and attending his brother's wedding was important. So, I decided to set aside my feelings and focus on making the best of the situation for the sake of family harmony. This brings us to the incident that occurred during Ethan and Serafina's ceremony. Several relatives couldn't resist admiring Charlotte, commenting on how adorable she looked. Serafina occasionally shot me disapproving glances whenever our eyes met. It was clear she still resented me for bringing Charlotte to her wedding, even though her baby was undoubtedly the star of the show, and I made no effort to seek attention. When the celebration moved to the reception area, my mother-in-law, Caleb, and I took turns watching Charlotte in our hotel room, just as we had planned. Although my mother-in-law became somewhat tipsy as the evening progressed, Caleb and I remained completely sober, focusing entirely on caring for our daughter. Midway through the reception, I noticed my mother-in-law, who was supposed to be with Charlotte at that moment, frantically searching for me. Something about her demeanor made my heart race, and I rushed over to discover what was wrong. Caleb, sensing trouble, followed closely behind. My mother-in-law's voice trembled as she whispered that Charlotte was missing. My heart plummeted. Caleb demanded clarification since he had just left our daughter in her care. That's when my mother-in-law admitted that Serafina had entered the room shortly after he left. They had chatted briefly, and at one point, my mother-in-law needed to use the bathroom. But when she returned, both Charlotte and Serafina had vanished. Confused and panicked, Caleb and I immediately found Ethan and asked him where Serafina was and why she would do something so alarming. Ethan seemed equally shocked by the situation. Amidst the celebrations and crowds, we alerted hotel staff to search for Charlotte and Serafina. The staff responded immediately, but neither could be found. After an hour of searching, I called the police. A hotel employee informed us that Charlotte and Serafina had been found behind the hotel. We rushed outside, feeling dreadful. When we arrived, we found Serafina sitting in a chair, holding Charlotte and smoking with her other hand. Her baby was in a carrier beside her. I cried as I examined Charlotte, making sure she was okay. Caleb demanded to know why Serafina had done this. My mother-in-law, now completely sober and frantic, screamed at Serafina, explaining that she had absolutely no right to take our daughter without permission and had deliberately disappeared while my mother-in-law was in the bathroom. Serafina simply smirked as she turned toward me, remarking that if I was so worried about my daughter, perhaps I should have listened to her request and not brought her to the wedding. I was stunned, realizing she had deliberately abducted my daughter. She wanted me to panic, searching desperately for my child just to frighten me and teach me a lesson, hoping I would surrender to her demands in the future. Ethan tried to calm everyone down, suggesting this might be a misunderstanding. At this point, the police asked if I still wanted to press charges. Looking at Serafina's expression, which showed no remorse or apology for her actions, I decided to proceed with kidnapping charges to ensure she never threatened my family again. Serafina's eyes widened with disbelief as she protested, but the police took her into custody immediately. Ethan begged me to reconsider, but my mother-in-law told him that his wife's actions were unforgivable. Thank you for following along. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around us.